There is a right that 40 million Americans believe they had, a right they exercised in 2020, a right they exercised in 2022, a right they plan to exercise again in November 2026 in what could be one of the most consequential midterm elections in modern American history. The Supreme Court of the United States just took it away, not quietly, not narrowly, with a decision that lands directly on the voting habits of tens of millions of Americans in 30 states across this country, and that takes effect immediately, meaning the rules that apply to how your ballot gets counted in November are not what they were the last time you voted. The case is called Watson versus the Republican National Committee. And what the court decided in this case is this: if you mail your ballot on Election Day or the day before Election Day, and the post office doesn't deliver it until the day after your vote for federal races does not count, it will not be counted, it will be set aside. It does not matter that you followed every instruction your state gave you. It does not matter that you mailed it on time. Under this ruling, if your ballot arrives after Election Day, it is too late. And for federal races, your congressman, your senator, it is gone. 30 states have laws on the books right now that say the opposite of what the Supreme Court just ruled. 30 states have what election lawyers call grace periods, windows of time after Election Day, anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks, during which mail ballots postmarked by Election Day are still accepted and counted. Millions of Americans in those states have been voting under those rules for years. Some of those states have been doing it since 2020, when the pandemic made mail voting the only safe option for tens of millions of people. As of this ruling, every one of those grace period laws for federal elections is now unconstitutional, or at minimum, legally vulnerable in ways that election officials are scrambling to figure out how to handle right now. And here is the part that should make every American, regardless of party, sit up and pay attention. This ruling does not just affect Democrat voters or Republican voters or independent voters. It affects every single person who votes by mail in a grace period state, veterans serving overseas, military families, senior citizens who mailed their ballot 4 days before Election Day because they could not drive to a polling place, rural Americans who live 45 minutes from the nearest post office and trusted that if they dropped their ballot in the mail on Election Day, their vote would be counted. For all of them in 30 states, the rules just changed. And it starts this July, how a 181-year-old law just rewrote voting rules for 2026. To understand what just happened, you need to understand the legal question at the center of this case, because the answer the Supreme Court gave is one that the people writing the 1845 law, it is based on, almost certainly never intended. In 1845, Congress passed a federal statute establishing a uniform national election day. Before that law, states could hold elections on different days, which created chaos and opportunities for manipulation. The 1845 law, and later a similar statute from 1875, established that federal elections for the House and Senate must take place on the same specific day nationwide, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. That law has been on the books ever since. Nobody disputes it. Nobody is challenging the idea that Election Day is Election Day. The question in Watson versus RNC was this: does the 1845 law mean that ballots must be cast by Election Day, or does it mean that ballots must be received by election officials by Election Day? Those are two completely different things. Casting a ballot means the moment you mark it and mail it or drop it in a box. Receiving a ballot is when the Postal Service delivers it to election officials, which can happen days after you actually voted. Mississippi, like 29 other states in the District of Columbia, had a law saying that if you cast your ballot, meaning you filled it out, sealed the envelope, put a stamp on it, and mailed it by Election Day, your ballot counted even if the post office took a few days to deliver it. Mississippi's specific grace period was 5 business days. Illinois allowed 14 days. Other states allowed 3 or 4 or 7. The Republican National Committee sued Mississippi in 2024, arguing that the 1845 law required ballots to be received by Election Day, not just cast. The Federal District Court of Mississippi sided with the state and upheld the grace period. The case went to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which reversed the district court and ruled in favor of the RNC, and Mississippi appealed to the Supreme Court. During oral arguments in March 2026, the justices' questions left very little doubt about where the court was headed. Multiple conservative justices expressed sympathy with the argument that Election Day means the deadline for the whole process, casting and receiving, not just for the moment a voter puts something in the mail, The questioning of the justices was skeptical of the grace period laws in ways that had election law experts emerging from the oral argument saying, on record, that the court appeared likely to rule against Mississippi. The ruling that just came down confirms what those experts predicted. The court held that federal election law, properly interpreted, sets Election Day as the deadline by which ballots for federal races must be received by election officials, not merely mailed. In practical terms, if your ballot for a congressional or Senate race arrives the day after Election Day, it does not count, regardless of when you mailed it. The court is applying its ruling to federal races, elections for the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. State and local races in some states may still be governed by state grace period laws, depending on how each state chooses to handle the alignment between its state and federal election rules. But for the races that determine control of Congress, the races with the biggest stakes in November 2026, Election Day is now a hard, firm, final deadline for ballot receipt. The 30 states and what they must do now. This is where the Watson decision becomes a logistical emergency for election officials across the country, and why the Starts This July part of this video title is not an exaggeration. It is a literal description of what is happening in state capitals right now. 30 states have grace period laws of some kind. Some of those grace periods apply to all absentee voters. Others are specifically designed for military and overseas voters who face unique challenges getting their ballots in on time. All of them are now legally affected by what the Supreme Court just decided. Here is the problem. The November 2026 midterms are 4.5 months away. Early voting and absentee voting processes for November begin in some states as early as late August or September. Election officials need to update their procedures, their voter information materials, their websites, their ballot return envelopes, and their training for poll workers and election staff. Millions of voters who have been mailing ballots under the assumption that they have a grace period need to be re-educated about a new deadline before November. All of that work has to happen between now and the fall. States are not being given years or even months to phase this in. The ruling is effective now. For the upcoming November 2026 and federal elections, ballots must be received by Election Day, not postmarked, period. Several of the most heavily affected states are among the largest in the country. New York allows 14 days after Election Day for ballots postmarked by Election Day to arrive and be counted. California allows 7 days. Illinois allows 14 days. Washington State allows 21 days. All of those grace periods for federal races are now unconstitutional under the Watson ruling. In New York alone, hundreds of thousands of mail ballots arrive after Election Day in a typical midterm election cycle. In the 2022 midterms, more than 200,000 ballots in New York arrived after Election Day, but were counted because of the state's grace period law. Those ballots included votes in competitive congressional races where the margins were razor thin. Under the new rule, none of those ballots would count for federal races. In California, which conducted its 2022 and 2024 elections with an expansive mail voting system, where millions of voters mail their ballots in the days immediately before Election Day, the implications are enormous. California had nearly 2 million ballots arrive after Election Day in 2022. The assumption embedded in California's voting system that postmarking by Election Day is sufficient is now gone for. Federal elections, states are in emergency mode right now, figuring out how to implement this. Some will call special legislative sessions to formally update their state laws. Others will issue guidance from their secretaries of state telling voters that the rules for federal races have changed. All of them will need to communicate the change directly to voters who have been voting by mail for years under the old system. If you live in any of the 30 grace period states, the single most important thing you can do after watching this video is find out exactly what your state is communicating to voters about the new deadline. Do not assume that because you voted by mail last time and your ballot was counted that the same timing will work this November. It will not. Not for your congressional race, not for your Senate race. The group this hurts most and why it matters. There is a specific category of Americans for whom the Watson ruling is not just an inconvenience or a deadline adjustment. And for these Americans, the ruling could directly result in their votes not being counted, even though they did everything right, followed every instruction, and mailed their ballot in perfectly good faith. Military voters. Here's a version with potentially triggering terms replaced. 30 states have laws that give extra time for overseas service members, their families, and citizens living abroad to submit their ballots. These voters often live in places where mail is slow or unreliable. A soldier in Germany or Japan, or a sailor at sea who mails their ballot 2 weeks before a major deadline has no guarantee it will arrive on time. Lawmakers addressed this problem in 1986 with a federal law requiring states to send ballots to these voters at least 45 days before a vote, giving them enough time to cast and return their ballots. But even with 45 days, many ballots still arrive late. The most common reason these ballots don't get counted is that they arrive after the deadline. More than 50 retired commanders and senior officials asked the nation's highest court to protect these extra time laws, saying they are critical for service members voting from abroad. Veterans groups argued that striking them down would hurt the voting rights of those in uniform, the opposite of what lawmakers intended. The court ruled against these protections anyway. While some legal experts believe overseas service members may still have some cover under existing federal law, the immediate result is widespread confusion among officials responsible for administering the process. For those stationed overseas and planning to participate in the upcoming midterm cycle, this confusion is very real. It could mean the difference between a vote counting or not. Veterans and military family groups are pushing lawmakers to clarify the rules before the deadline, but whether that happens in time remains uncertain. The bottom line? Millions of mail-in voters are being asked to change long-standing habits based on a ruling made just months before one of the most significant votes in recent memory. In that context, a ruling that changes how mail-in ballots are counted, affecting 30 states and tens of millions of voters, is not a technical election administration adjustment. It is a change to the rules of a game that is already being played with enormous political consequences for both parties and for the country. Mail voting has expanded dramatically since 2020. In the 2024 presidential election, approximately 43% of all ballots cast nationwide were mail ballots. That is a number that has grown election by election over the past 20 years and that accelerated sharply during the COVID-19 pandemic. Mail voters are not a monolithic political group. They include Republicans, Democrats, independents, elderly voters, disabled voters, rural voters, and military voters of every political stripe. But the infrastructure of mail voting, the systems, the deadlines, the assumptions about when a vote counts is now suddenly and significantly different from what it was the last time Americans voted. Election officials are facing an emergency communication problem. Voters in grace period states who have been voting by mail for years need to know that the rules changed. They need to know that mailing their ballot on Election Day is no longer sufficient for it to count in federal races. They need to know that. They need to mail their ballot earlier than they ever have before, or vote in person, or use an early voting option that ensures their ballot is physically in the hands of election officials by the close of polls on Election Day. The United States Postal Service recommends mailing a ballot at least 1 week before the deadline. In a world where the deadline was 5 days after Election Day, mailing a week before Election Day was comfortable. In a world where the deadline is Election Day itself, mailing a week before Election Day is now the absolute minimum. And given that mail delivery times have become less reliable in many parts of the country in recent years, many election experts are now recommending that mail voters in affected states mail their ballots 10 to 14 days before Election Day to be confident their ballot will arrive in time. 14 days before Election Day in 2026 is October 22nd. If you plan to vote by mail in November, you need to be thinking about your ballot not as something to fill out and mail a day or two before the election. You need to be treating it more like a package you need delivered by a specific date. And at times, something that requires planning, lead time, and attention to Postal Service reliability in your area. Here's a simpler, filter-friendly version. What you need to do right now. Here is your action list. Specific, concrete things you can do this week and this month to make sure your vote is counted. Step 1. Find out if your state is affected and what the current rules are. Start with your state's official elections website. Many states are still updating their guidance. If you don't see updated information, call or email your state's elections office directly. Ask one simple question. What is the deadline for my mailed ballot to be received for the upcoming federal election? Try to get that answer in writing. Step 2. If you plan to vote by mail, move your timeline up significantly. Do not wait until the week before the deadline to request your ballot. Request it as soon as your state makes them available, often in late summer. Fill it out and send it back as early as possible. Officials now recommend mailing at least 2 weeks before the deadline, since your ballot must arrive by that date, not just be postmarked. Step 3, consider voting in person if your mail service is unreliable. If you live somewhere with slow or inconsistent mail, or if you travel frequently, Switching to in-person voting may be the safest option. Most states with strong mail programs also offer early in-person options in the weeks before the deadline. Step 4. If you are serving overseas or living abroad, seek guidance immediately. Visit feap.gov for specific guidance on how to request and return ballots from abroad. Do not assume the same rules from past cycles still apply. Contact your base voting assistance officer. Confirm your ballot request is in the system and return your ballot as early as possible. Step 5. Tell the people in your life who vote by mail that the rules changed. Most people affected by this change are not closely following legal news. They may mail their ballot the same way they always have, not knowing anything is different. If you know someone who votes by mail, tell them the key change. Your ballot must arrive by the deadline, not just be mailed by then. That is now the rule for federal races. The bigger picture, there is a question underneath all of this that Americans of every political background should be asking, and that is this: who decides how easy or hard it is for Americans to vote in federal elections? For most of American history, the answer has been clear. States decide how their elections are run. The founders built a federal system deliberately, and election administration has always been a state function. States decide when polling places are open. States decide what identification voters need. States decide how absentee ballots work. Congress can set the date of elections and establish certain baseline protections, but the mechanics of voting have always been left largely to the states. The Watson ruling narrows that state authority in a specific and significant way by holding that a 181-year-old federal law preempts state grace period laws for federal elections. The court is taking a decision that 30 states made, including Republican-led states and Democratic-led states, and overriding it based on a reinterpretation of statutory language that those states had read very differently for the better. Part of 2 centuries, whether you think that outcome is correct depends in part on your views about federalism, about the history of American election law, and about whether the court read the 1845 statute correctly. Those are legitimate debates that lawyers and constitutional scholars will be having for years. What is not debatable is the practical reality on the ground. The rules have changed. The clock is ticking. November 2026 is 4.5 months away, and the 40 million Americans whose mail voting habits are affected by this ruling need to know about it now, not in October, not after it is too late to change their plans. The Supreme Court just made a decision, and now it is your turn to make one. Know the new deadline, plan accordingly, make sure your vote counts. The midterms are coming, and make sure you are ready for them under the rules that actually exist in the fall of 2026, not the rules you assumed were still in place.